Hi again. My name is Cyrus Worrells, and I'm Director of Programs at the Institute for Spirituality and Health at the Texas Medical Center. And for anybody who's new to ISH, as I continue to admit some people, for anybody new to ISH, the Institute for Spirituality and Health turned 65 a year ago. I guess we're about to turn 66, but we're not retiring anytime soon. We began as the first nationally accredited chaplaincy training program, one of the first 8 institutions in the TMC. And we've done a number of things over the years, chaplaincy related, also related to biomedical ethics, and in the education and service of healthcare practitioners and institutions, as well as towards public health and the education of the lay public. So we do a lot of things to serve our mission of enhancing well-being by exploring the relationship between spirituality and health. And we know that takes many forms for many people. So we work directly with faith communities and explore the rich faith traditions of our Houston community and at large, as well as how anybody finds spirituality and makes meaning and connection in life. A definition we like to use for spirituality for anybody who asks, which is many who hear about us, comes from our president, John Graham, who's here with us tonight, who says that spirituality involves our innate ability as humans to connect with one another, to connect with our environment and the creatures of our environment, to connect with the transcendent mystery that many of us call God or Allah or Krishna or Great Spirit, or may choose not to name. And perhaps the deepest and maybe the most challenging level of connection is to connect with ourselves. And I think all of those levels of connection have perhaps been disrupted, but also, maybe perhaps transformed in this last year. And so I think this program that has been organized by our dear friend, Dr. Virgil Fry, couldn't be more timely or more resonant with where we are as individuals and as a species. So with that, I'm just, again, from ISH going to welcome you. Thanks for being a part of this community. And for more of our programs, you can check us out at spiritualityandhealth.org. But now I'd like to turn it over to the mastermind behind tonight's evening and the 3-part series. Dr. Virgil Fry, like I said, longtime friend and partner of the Institute. He's been the executive director at Lifeline Chaplaincy for, I think, couple decades, if not more. I don't know exactly when you started, but has done a wonderful job with Lifeline Chaplaincy, and we're trying to engage him more and more in the work that we do at ISH. But he's certainly a resilient man himself and brings a wealth of lifetime experiences and challenges to bear in a compassionate way. So I'm not going to take any more of his time. With that, I just thank you all again, and thank you, Virgil. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
I kind of like hearing you talk about me, so that's not all. Thank you, Cyrus. I've looked forward to this opportunity and have enjoyed working with Cyrus and setting it up, and I think you'll gain a lot, particularly from our 3 presenters as they tell their stories, some of the things they've not only endured, but have learned to manage in some ways, and to be changed by their experiences. We are in flux all the time in this life. It's just part of the created order. So we are certainly, as Cyrus alluded to this past year, as a community, as a world, have certainly had to learn new ways to think, to act, to restrain ourselves, to limit ourselves, to fight over masks and other important things like that. And it's been you add that to what each of us is dealing with individually, it's a lot. You can feel the sense of oppressiveness sometimes as a community or as a nation as we're going through this. And feel it lifting a little bit. Uh, we don't want to let our guards down too early. That you pay a price when you do that. But let me introduce our topic a little bit, and then I will introduce our special guest speakers that we're honored to have with us, and invite you also for next Monday night, which we'll have a different panel of caregivers, people that are in that role or have been in that role, and the uniqueness of when that is a part of your life journey. And the last one deals with serious or chronic illness and the adjustments that go with that. So thank you. And here we go with Zoom 101 for Virgil. I'm going to work on PowerPoint here. And we're going to play this. There we go. And I need to minimize you. I like looking at you, but I don't need to be looking over my slide, blocking my slides here. So this is who we are. At the end of this session, as Cyrus says, you'll be able to send chat questions if you have them for a particular presenter. Also at the end, he will send an email if you have some follow-up questions for later. So we welcome you. Oh, come on. Looks nice and peaceful, doesn't it? Easy going, a nice straight road, landscape on either side, some hills and mountains in the distance. And this is really, I think, if we had our preference, how we would like life to be. We often seek homeostasis, those comfortable routines that provide us with the security of consistency. Homeostasis, you learned in biology, is when nature tries to find a balance between two things. As I was thinking about that in my daily life, I thought, every morning when I get up and do my grooming technique, I pretty well have the same pattern. I have it set up. I take my shower, uh, I get in front of the mirror, get my electric razor and shave. And then in my cabinet, I have from right to left everything that I need, deodorant, aftershave, all the fun medications that I get to take at my age. And it's a pattern. It's my comfort zone. When I travel, I have to think through, okay, what do I need to take? What is changing here? It's just it's kind of how we do things. During the freeze, I was fortunate enough to have electricity, but my condominium complex did not have hot water, which is a minor problem considering some that many people dealt with. But I was amazed how many times I went to the hot water faucet and turned it on expecting to wash my hands, because that's just what I do. It's my comfort zone. That's my balance. And I know people whose electricity was off, and they said over and over again they'd go to the light switch just to turn it on when they go into another room. Again, that's a pattern where we find consistency. We need that. If you have a worship place, you may have a designated area that's yours, your pew, or at least the section that you sit in that's always the same. And if somebody dares to sit in yours, you have to adjust, don't you? It's like, oh, that's not right. And we go to grocery stores, we do some of the same things a lot. Our family patterns are often routine. We eat at certain times, we at certain times, go to bed at certain times. It's how we do things. And yet, what I find over and over again is that I don't care how consistent I try to be, how organized I try to be, life often interrupts. And that's what we're talking about tonight. So, like a lightning bolt coming out of the sky, things begin to happen. Precious objects of ours can break. Friends betray. Families splinter in ways that you never dreamed of. There's very few people I know of who've gone through some very difficult family splits and changes who, when they entered into that family, planned on that to happen. It often happens anyway. Loved ones die, completely changing your relationship with them. Dreams shatter when your dreams that you have held dear do not come true. Health can degenerate. Weather destroys. We in Houston particularly know about that one. Wars rage outside of our country and often inside it as well. Finances can be a challenge or disappear. And our faith that we have and how things ought to be, either in how the higher power should respond or our own belief system, can disappoint us. And on that list could go, but that's the world we live in. We're constantly adjusting, we're constantly coping, and we're constantly seeking stability when these things happen. There's almost a state of shock when something drastic changes. And even if it's something we choose, like changing a job or changing a role, um, there is a transition that goes on that disrupts us. It creates discomfort in us because we don't know what the new is going to hold, and we like to hold on to the comfort of the past, even if it's not where we want to stay. We often are in denial about how serious this change may be. How many of us, when we first heard the news of COVID back a year ago, said, "Well, you know, this adjustment will be for a month or 6 weeks." I know my organization, we had a retreat scheduled at a retreat center for the whole staff and our volunteers, and we had it planned for May. And then we said, well, June will be safe, so we changed it to June. June is when the surge really happened. And so we said, well, by November, so we could change it. The place would let us change it to November. So that's what we did. And we thought, well, that'll do it. Well, in November, we were able to have it, but it was not without telling people you need to mask up. We're still in COVID and we have to be very aware. Uh, Nobody dreamed that our current time we would still be meeting. At least I didn't dream of it. So we tend to segment or try to do things in that. There's a certain amount of anger and resentfulness at this change that's been imposed on us. Patients that are put in the hospital are often highly frustrated. The things that they get to choose about, what to eat or drink or wear, all of those choices have been put aside, and usually somebody else is making those choices for us. And we began to look for resources, how to get through this, how to cope um, emotionally and spiritually. We began to tap inside and we learn, we hope to rely on others. As was so well said, our innate ability to connect really gets called on when crisis transition happens. Again, whether we cause it or whether it's caused by the environment that we're in. And there's this constant desire to return to whatever normal is or whatever normal feels like. William Bridges, in his book Transition, talks about, I think, a wonderful illustration of how a transition feels when you're in the middle of it. It is if we launched out from a riverside dock to cross to a landing on the opposite shore, only to discover in midstream that the landing was no longer there. And when we looked back at the other shore, we saw that the dock we had left from had just broken loose and was headed downstream. I mean, I bet every one of you can describe moments in your life when you left a dock, and maybe not on purpose, but you were moving and you thought you knew where you were going, and looked up, and that place was no longer available. And you look back and say, "Well, I'll go back," and that place is no longer available anymore. like you're in the middle, you're going downstream, and you're not quite sure where this is headed. It's a very frustrating, threatening. We go into survival mode many times. Um, and yet, in reality, our world is in constant change. Just look at the technology world that we live in. This kind of presentation, I wouldn't have dreamed of making 5 years ago. Uh, I didn't think in these terms. Most of us don't. Look at what your cell phone does. It's basically a computer that has a telephone in it. It does things that are incredible, and we feel lost now when we don't have them. Um, Somebody said the other day, I remember when I was smarter than my phone. I can relate to that because there's so much that a phone does that I don't know what it does or how it does it. Politics change, uh, families change. I've been through the death of my wife in 2007 after being married for 33 years. And the first part of that felt like I was in the middle of that river. Knowing I couldn't go back, it would never be the same again. And I had no idea what it was going to be like on the other shore. And since that point, I've also lost through death my father-in-law, my mother, my sister-in-law, all within a period of about 6 months. And then since then, my father has died, two aunts, his two sisters, and several others. So our whole family has kind of been on this transition mode, and we still are in many ways, learning new ways to be that we didn't have to do uh, 13 or 14 years ago. Just some reflective thoughts about it. Transitions of any nature involve a sense of loss. Something has to change or die in order that something new can grow. What's true in the cycle of nature recreating itself is also true in any component of growth. Acknowledging the pain of the loss is a major step in healing in order to grow into newer, deeper realms. I like to hike, particularly in national forest or anywhere that I can. But I remember being in Yellowstone one time on a hike after a fire had gone through a few years earlier. And the particular path I was on was beginning to regrow. And I stopped at a tree stump that was a burned stump. And out of that stump was coming a brand new tree, uh, gaining life from what had been there before and was starting over in a whole new way. So it was from the same tree, but it wasn't the same tree. So sometimes finding ways to grieve over the loss, to just sit with the mystery of that, to let ourselves feel the emotions and the spiritual warfare that goes on when something has been taken away. To me, that has to be done in order for healing to take place. And it helps us to realize the preciousness of what we had, and also perhaps to realize we cannot go back the way that it was in the same way, but we can move on. We are resilient people. We are created to continue in new ways. And then we find the resources that help us to do that in good ways. I remember as my wife Carol was her at age 52 or 3, I think, as she'd been a type 1 diabetic for 50 years, her health really began to fail. And her doctor finally said, "You have got to stop teaching school." That's what she did and what she loved. And, uh, and so she did, went on medical disability, but with much chagrin, anger, disappointment, and feeling purposeless for a long time. And as I was with her, and as she began to have other health problems, including I became aware that that grief was real. I was not with the same person that I had been with when she was healthy and vibrant and alive fully. Still the same person, but there was grief involved on her behalf and on mine because things were changing and they would never be the same. So we learned to move on. In the Houston Chronicle recently, a U8 professor, Dr. Christensen, who lost her husband to a plane crash a year ago, right before COVID, and then was talking about also adjusting to COVID. Made, I think, a pretty profound observation. In life's hardest moments, two things are true and usually more, but two often sharply distinct items show up: hope and dread, desire and aversion, loss and restoration, light and dark. Alongside love and anxiety, COVID times remind us that we need both permanence and change. Recognize that it's never one thing. For me, the created order is always working between this polarity of chaos and order, chaos and order. It's, it's true in the world of nature, it's true within our own lives. And we're always working between those two polarities, trying to find that balance, that homeostasis. Sometimes we're better at it than others. But I like the how she puts the polarities there: hope and dread, desire and aversion, loss and restoration, light and dark. They play against each other, and darkness helps us to appreciate light. And this last quote, and then I'm going to turn it over to the experts here, is from Sister Joan Chittister, a contemplative nun, who talks about in her book, Scarred by Struggle. Struggle brings us to crossover points in life, after which we become new people, sometimes worse, often better, but always different. You've probably heard the phrase, crisis can make you bitter or better. And I think that is true. Sometimes it's a little bit of both for many of us. You're never quite the same again. And yet we can move on. All right, let's go this way. Now I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'll turn this PowerPoint off and let you see the people that are going to share some of their stories with us. There we go. We're really honored to have these three with us. Judy Seibert is from Abilene, Texas, which is in Taylor County, in case y'all didn't know. The home of Abilene Christian University. Her husband, a good friend of mine, he was a longtime professor at ACU. He headed up or started the Doctor of Ministry program there. Seen as a resource, particularly within our fellowship of Churches of Christ across the world. He was often called in as a mediator and one who would bring people together in some very difficult times. But he had some very difficult life transitions that she'll tell you about, that they as a family had to work through. And so I'm going to let Judy start first, and without further introduction, I'll then let Jose Cedillo speak. Jose is a chaplain supervisor, a chaplain educator is the term these days at VHA, no, I forgot what it's called. It's St. Luke's Hospital here in Houston. It's, he can correct me, CHA, Baylor St. Luke's in the Medical Center. Jose is a tremendous teacher and leader. We've been friends for many, many years in all that he's done. In his own growth, he's also dealt with many family issues and some of his own health issues, and I'll let him share that with you as well. And then Don Payne, a good friend of mine who attends worship with me here in Houston. We've been friends. We met actually as I was hosting a grief support group, probably 15 or 20 years ago, when he was dealing with the death of his son, age 25, in a car wreck. And since then, he's had other tragedies that I will let him share with you and explain some of the things that we're also talking about of major transitions, grief and loss, and rebirth. I'm giving each of them 12 minutes about. We're not going to cut them off, but I will let them know when it's 10 minutes, and after that point, we'll open it up as a group discussion. So Judy, if you're there, if you don't mind, we'll begin with you.
I've unmuted, right? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be here and to share my story. And I appreciate very much Virgil's friendship and his consistent support and love through the years. Thank you. My story is about a man of faith, Charles Seibert, whose life was disrupted, who served, led, and died young. In 1971, we were fresh out of Abilene Christian and we moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, our first church. He was educated and ready for a pastorate, and I was a school counselor in a lovely new school, and all was good. It was all good. There, Charlie began to notice some difficulty seeing when he was reading. The eye specialist saw something, but could not give a definitive diagnosis. He was thinking perhaps he was pre-diabetic because of some of those deposits on his retina. So we went on a healthy diet. We felt better and looked good, and all was good. Still visiting the eye doctor regularly. In 1974, we were called to a new church in Tyler, Texas. Young pastor, 29 years old. Charlie was ready, willing, and able to go. And he was on all cylinders his whole life. But he had a series over the years, the first few years we were there, of car accidents, 3 car crashes. Thankfully, no one was injured. Cars were bunged up and Charlie's pride was injured. On the third one, he realized I looked, but I couldn't see the car in my center of vision. And after many visits to a retinal specialist in Houston, and thank you, are you hearing me okay, Roy? Okay. After many visits to Houston with Virgil picking him up at the airport and getting him to those appointments, he was finally diagnosed with Stargardt's disease, which is a rare form of macular degeneration where the center of vision is slowly lost. It is genetic and it's often found in children and young adults. It is progressive, uncurable. We were scared to death. We were panicked in a sense. The reality was that Charlie would slowly go blind. He wouldn't be able to read. He wouldn't be able to drive. How are we gonna, what now is how we were feeling. It was kind of like watching David go out to Goliath, facing the giant there. One Sunday, we were praying over an older man who was a leader of our church. He was stepping down because his diabetes had caused him to go blind. And this dear man with a shock of gorgeous gray hair, his shoulders drooping, tears streaming down his face. And I felt so much empathy for him. And I imagined Charlie, and it was the one time that it totally hit me so hard, it took my breath away, what all we were dealing with. And the fear, the helplessness, the anger, the loss. I know life is full of acquisition and relinquishment. I do the first better than the second. And I find that we've learned so much, and I'll share all that. We learned that naming the loss is not a cure, but it is a way of discovering the power and goodness of friends and family that became like the Spirit leading us and guiding us and holding us up. We also found a book that spoke to us. It was written by Robert Kemper, who was a minister with the exact same disease that Charlie had. And he stated, "I have lived with eyesight that failed, and it can be done." The name of his book is The Elephant's Ballet, and I will tell more about the title in a bit. I want to share with you some excerpts from that book. From Robert Kemper, 1970. "I can read what I've written. Reading is important to me. I enjoy my work as a pastor journalist, and I'm loving the ordered life in my home. I'm a happy man." In 1971, "I cannot read what I have written. A strange eye disease has struck my eyes. I have 2 blind centers. I'm not totally blind. I do have peripheral vision, but I may as well be. It's progressive. It is permanent, irrevocable. There is no future." In 1972, I can see what I have written, but with great difficulty. I've made up my mind to do the best I can. I have help from some weird glasses and some wonderful people. A church wants me to become their minister. I cannot do that. Who ever heard of a blind minister? Thank you, God, but I'm not up to that. 1974. I can read, but with great difficulty. I lead our congregational church. I preach, I teach, and administer this large church. There are some things I do not do well. There are some things that I cannot do at all. My wife, Margie, is learning to be the chauffeur, the repairman, and the bookkeeper of the household. It's not the way either of us wants it to be. But we are managing, and that will have to do. Thank you, God, for saving me. Charlie and I learned that it was not the loss of vision that was crippling us. It was a loss of heart. Charlie loved the story of David and Goliath and David's quote, "The Lord has rescued me from the paws of the lion and the paws of the bear, and he will rescue me from this giant," brought us both to face what really does faith mean. And faith is not magic. It's not Santa Claus. It is courage, believing that deep down, I have what it takes to walk through this pain and to walk through this crisis, to get through it. The only way to get through it is through it. It's a hard lesson. Kemper insisted on the title, The Elephant's Ballet. It's his personal metaphor. He said it's the incongruity of Disney's Dumbo and paired with Rudolf Nureyev's beautiful ballet. It's, on one hand, it's funny. On one hand, it's sad. It may not be good ballet, but it's amazing that he can do it at all. And it's one sense it's lousy, and another sense totally amazing. That's how it is with wounded healers. That's how it is with people who respond to loss. That's how it is who are saved, people who are saved by grace. It's just amazing we get through it at all. In 2009, at the age of 62, Charlie was diagnosed with IgM, multiple myeloma, a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. It's often treatable, and folks, especially with some of the new targeted drugs that are out there now, and folks have lived as long as 15 years with the new treatments that are available. That was the hope we grabbed onto right there when we got that diagnosis. The journey began with a hope of remission. The first reports were somewhat positive, but the rare vicious cancer was resistant, and our 3-year journey was filled with relationships with doctors, chaplains, nurses' aides, pharmacists, and many lab reports, mostly bad lab reports. Charlie saying one time, "We really could use some good news today," but we didn't get that good news. We endured those horrible realities of cancer treatments, bone marrow transplants, long hospital stays that wear on even the calmest of spirits, strong chemotherapy, isolation, where only those dressed like an astronaut could come in the room. I could only see him through a small window, a very dark time for us. For Charlie, a gregarious, fun-filled person, being alone for long periods became torture, and I felt helpless and completely lost and overwhelmed. After the last chance from a major cocktail of chemo, we both agreed, enough. We entered a lovely hospice room with accommodations for our families and our friends. We shared our time with loving conversations and tearful goodbyes. We were comforted by the presence and the love from others who quietly were with us in that room. And I was at his side holding his hand when he breathed his last breath. The departure of life eclipses everything. When a death is good, the room is filled with peace, and all the pain that went before it is forgotten. Where there was mystery and unknowns, there is now love. Christ's words, "I was sick and you visited me," have new meaning to me. You can pretend to care, but you cannot pretend to show up. And we had the loving presence and care from family and friends showing up in many ways. One person we hardly knew who lived a lot far away, we had only met him once. He showed us his encouragement, a word of encouragement on every single caring bridge that we posted over those 3 years. He never missed one. And I looked forward to seeing what Buck was going to say. He lived with us through this whole journey, and he showed up. I will always remember with love our friend Buck. Grief is not a sickness, and you don't get over it. You live on. I have learned that the wisdom of grief is a treasure for your broken heart. It helps you to always remember so that the one who is gone will never be forgotten and helps you to go on. C.S. Lewis says, that's the deal. Great love, great grief. It does not blunt the reality of your loss, grief, but it seeks to transform it. The intense pain of grief is a tribute. I have learned that love is an answer for most of the messes in our lives. And I've also learned that a life well lived is never cut short. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you, Judy. And I want to thank also Virgil and the Institute of Religion for allowing us to be part of this. My story is probably not as linear or as with ending that may have, you may have heard from other stories. My story is actually about two people in my life that were very influential in my life. One of them I will share more of it in his name because he passed away. That was my father. But the other one is still alive. And out of respect for that person and that person's ideas about what I share about that person, I'll try to limit some of what I share about that other person because that other one's still alive and he's an adult. So my story is about mental illness. I guess I every time I am able to share some of my story, I usually don't do much. I use my story to inform me, to help me educate some of the chaplains that are in my programs. But when I do that, I always bring the question about, is there any kind of spirituality in the mental illness crisis? Is there any kind of spiritual aspects of a mental illness? My father story with what doctors in Mexico call schizophrenia, but it wasn't a clear diagnosis. That was kind of, I remember I was probably 7 years old when I heard that word. Didn't understand what it was. Later on in life, when I was at MD Anderson, I was part of the chaplain there, and one of the persons that was part of the palliative care team, like for lack of better, where I call it the psych nurse that was part of that. When I shared my story, she said to me, you know, it sounds like your father was not a schizophrenic. It sounds like he probably was very deeply depressed due to some grief. And so that's kind of like the story or the motto of these two stories of two people in my life. It's first this unclear diagnosis. It wasn't clear to know more about my father because of the lack of resources we had in Mexico and not able to continue treatment. We moved to the US. My mother, hopefully seeking some opportunities for him to maybe be treated here, but that didn't happen. And one day he just escaped the house and ended up, somebody found him outside of what is called now Harris Health. In those days, it was called Bentop Hospital, and admitted him to somewhere to the ER because he was quote quote acting strange in the parking lot. We still don't know who brought him to the parking lot, how he got there. He didn't drive, he didn't have a car, and we lived about probably 13 miles, 14 miles from Bentop, and so he shows up there. And then later on, we are told that he's admitted into the psych unit. But again, with no diagnostics available, a week later, we get another call after Sunday school that he had just passed. And my mother in her grief and all of us in grief, we just had to deal with the reality of death and not even asking what happened when the doctor offered an autopsy for my father. My mother, in her traditional cultural way, said, no, it's too late. What for? She was not well informed about autopsies, so she said, they're gonna mess up his body more, so I don't want him to cut him or anything like that. So she did not agree to an autopsy. So we never know what killed my father, whether it was a wrong medicine or something that happened there, something that triggered. Maybe he got into a fight with somebody there and he ended up dead. So the difficulty of this story for me is, again, the spirituality behind it, and that's why I call it, what are the spiritual issues? Because in those days, the church that my parents used to go to, my mother used to go to, didn't know how to deal with the situation. And simply when my father approached the person that was in charge of spiritual care there, the person just said, I don't have time, I don't know how to deal with this. Why don't you go to other alternative ways, other alternative people? And my mother had a sister-in-law that kept telling her to go to this lady which practiced witchcraft mixed with some religious things, and that person would be able to help him, because in her estimation of that person, my father was demon possessed, and it wasn't anything about mental illness. It was all that. So my mother feeling rejected from the church where she went to another church where they immediately said, okay, the pastor's going to go visit him, gave her a Bible, talked to her about salvation and Jesus Christ and all that. So we came to the Pentecostal church through the crisis of my father. And the difficulty of that is, again, the spirituality behind it. In this newfound church, we had people that visited us, helped us try to visit him, but they were afraid of him because they said that we're very literal in the interpretation of scripture, that if you're not quote right with the Lord and you go visit a demon possessed person, the results could be disastrous. You could be embarrassed or ashamed if that person does that to you. So not only the pastor tried to go once, and then my father didn't let him go through the door. He took a 2x4 and told him if he put one more step in the house, he was going to hit him with a 2x4. So when my father it's found there in bed top, and he's found to be having these difficulties and then dies, the pastor of this church that was here in Houston said something in the funeral that really, really shook me off. He said, well, the only sad thing about this is that, Mr. Cedillo went straight to hell because demon-possessed people cannot go into heaven. And so it was very shocking to me. I was 14 to really hear that story and to try to make sense from my faith, from my spirituality, which at that time was very little and very much, the pastor says something, that's what it is. You don't question it. And so that was I think the most damaging things for me, to hear that part of my story didn't end up with a good ending. My hope was shattered because my theology of hell was, you never get out of there. You go there and that's it. You're lost for eternity. There's no more hope for you. So it was very hard to see that. Forward out a few years later, then the story I never thought that these things were gonna happen to me and I was gonna deal with this ever in my life. I was getting to a point after my marriage. I got married at 22, and then 3-4 years later, things began happening. And then 10 years later, I never thought I was going to have to be dealing with the same thing, because another person that is dear to me was also dealing with mentally ill issues. And this time I'm like totally on the other side. This has nothing to do with spirituality. This has nothing to do with beliefs. This is all chemical in your brain. But this person, being an adult, also didn't agree to the available treatments, like psychotherapy or other available treatments, because he believed that the way he was thinking, it was not any kind of illness at all. It actually was his beliefs. And again, that led that person into, drug abuse and all that. And so all that was connected. And I was trying to say, okay, here's the same story repeating again in another person in my life that I love and care. But in this case, this person, doesn't see any kind of mental illness, doesn't see any kind of psychological help. He thinks that everything it has to do with what you believe and what's available for you and what drugs can do to you to help you deal with your thoughts and the crisis of facing this world, who was against that person. So this time it felt more like a chronic illness. Reading things about suffering, like some of you are familiar with Eric Cassell and this book of The Nature of Suffering, The Goals of Medicine, helped me intellectually, but as Judy said previously, emotionally, the suffering was still there. My father had died, apparently had gone to hell, according to the pastor that I had. I later on came to the conclusion that that wasn't possible, that illness is illness, and that God wouldn't punish him for that. But the question remained the same. What happens if this person that I'm now dealing with, that is love, is close to my heart, what if he dies? And he says that he's not, the drugs are not going to kill him. Everything that the society thinks about drugs is just we all been brainwashed by the modern society, especially the Christian societies. He says he's not Christian, and that is his way of dealing with it. And in the meantime, I'm dealing with, how do I help? How do I sustain myself and my spouse as we go through this different crisis, and yet again a similar situation. Sometimes the tendency when I'm suffering, I tend to go to what I call the good old days. When I was little, I remember my dad being well and caring for us and bringing food to the house and everything, all those days that we all wish they would have returned. When I think of this person that I have now, I'm thinking of the days when, childhood and all the innocence that was there before. And sometimes that kind of helps me escape the present suffering, but it is not, it's just something momentarily. It's almost like probably my own intellectual drug to go back and escape to the good old days. The last piece I want to say is that part of my culture where I grew up in the church where I was and in the families is also the issue of shame. These things happens to you because something is probably not right. Something is not that God is bad or anything. It's just something that you missed or something that you did. And I had to really work hard to escape that kind of mentality that was very much ingrained into my growing up and into my personal faith, and not judge myself or not judge the person that I love and I care for now. So to me, the suffering doesn't have an end. It is not clear. It could be mental illness. It could be drug use. It could be both together. Sometimes I remember one of my CP supervisors telling me that usually people that have mental illnesses, they also have, addictions that they are dealing with. And so this is a daily struggle. This is something that I don't see a hopeful future or a future that is different. I actually try to not even think about the future. I just think about the present and the present strength. I think Judy said something that struck me in terms about faith is the strength to go through the situation right now. And so I focus on the here and now. I don't even think about there's going to be one day when things are going to change, or I don't look at it that way. And it may feel pessimistic to some, but for me, Miguel de la Torre talks about in his book, Embracing Hopelessness, about the way to differentiate between despair and desperation. And what he said in his 2019 speech to the ACP educators in our conference really got me thinking about focusing on how to deal with the present. Despair gives an image of somebody on the floor just curled up and not able to do anything, while desperation keeps the person active, moving to deal with the everyday results of the crisis or whatever happened. So I find myself desperate in that sense, and always dealing with, okay, what's it going to be today? How is this person that I love is going to, do the next day or the next month or the next year? Would this person be alive? And those questions that I ask myself on a daily basis, and sometimes I don't. I get tired of thinking and asking. I don't worry. It's not about I'm worried about tomorrow. It's just questions that I have. I used to always worry. I used to not be able to sleep. I can't sleep now, and so does my wife. She sleeps also. But there are times where the sleepless nights come back and things that happen in our lives. So my story is about dealing with mental illness twice. And is there any spiritual issues behind it? Is there any spirituality that goes along with connecting or feeling disconnected with the person that is going through that crisis? Again, the surprise for me was that I never thought I was going to deal with it again in my life. After my father died at 52, and we didn't look for more answers. We just said, okay, it is what it is. And I think that to me, it's something that from the Buddhist thought has helped me to keep going, to say, well, it is what it is. I'm not going to think too much about a different, bright and hopeful future. I'm just going to think about what do I need to do today to keep going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Don Payne. First of all, can everyone hear me fine?
Yes.
All right, good. Just wanted to make sure. I do appreciate the opportunity, Virgil, to talk about my experiences over the last 20, 25 years regarding loss. And one reason why I do this is because I think there are a lot of people who are like me who need to hear certain things about grief and experiencing grief, because society tells us one thing, but I believe reality is something altogether different. And along with being different, it is better. It is better. So let me just give you a little bit of background. I came to Houston in 1987. And when I came here, I was married and I had 3 children, ages at that time, 13, 6, and 7, Elton, Mindy, and Christy. Elton was my oldest, my firstborn. And I have to tell you about Elton. He was Mr. Personality, type A personality, all the mothers loved him. And the reason why I say that is because when he dated, he used to always say, yes, ma'am, no, sir, and all that. So everybody just loved him. And he was smart. And I was just really, really proud of him. So, and incidentally, I have 4 children total and 5 grandkids. Let's move ahead now to the mid-1990s. By this time, I'd been in Houston for almost 10 years. And in 1990, I had gotten divorced. And it was a pretty devastating divorce for me and all the kids. But I was a single dad of 3 kids, really enjoyed it, because actually their mother abandoned the kids. And after she left in 1990, I haven't seen her since then. But I thought that I had a responsibility, and I'm glad that the kids, all 3 of them came to live with me. And one thing that I promised them was that I would make sure that we wouldn't move anymore until all 3 of them had graduated. When they were with their mother, in the course of 1 year, they had been to 3 different schools and lived in 4 different places. And I said, okay, we're going to stay here till all of you all graduate. And I was the dad that went to everything. I mean, I went to everything, that all the athletic activities. Both my daughters, Mindy and Christy, were on the flag team. They were involved in all kinds of things. I mean, I was there for everything because I thought that God had given me the responsibility to be a single parent, and I was going to do the best job I could. So this was in the 1990s, and things I thought were going well. The kids were growing. By then, by about 2000, Elton was 24 years old. Mindy was 15 and Christy was 14. And by this time, Elton also had a child. He had gotten married too. So things are going very well. But on October 14th, 2000, I remember I was wakened from a nap. I was actually sleeping in my condo. And when I picked up the phone, it was Elton's wife, and she was literally screaming on the phone, "He's gone, he's gone." I said, who? And she told me that she had not heard from Elton since last night. And it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And she has just received a call that he'd been killed in a car accident, and that they needed me to come down to the coroner's office to identify him. So I called my oldest daughter, Mindy. She was in town. Christy was out of town at the time, but was headed back. And me and Mindy, and I remember her boyfriend, went down to the coroner's office. And when I went down there, they gave me a picture. And of course, I identified him. And the level of grief that I went through and that the family went through is just indescribable. Just completely indescribable. And it wasn't only just grief, it was that sense of loss. He was my oldest. He was the leader. He was the one that would carry the family. I mean, all this stuff. And so it was very, very difficult. But I've always been a practicing Christian, always been very, very involved in church. And the church I was attending at the time, they really rallied to help us out, help out the family, help us to plan the funeral. And I remember that on the night that Elton died, I was supposed to go to a banquet later on that evening to a banquet for a new job. And I remember the lady who was to be my boss called me up like at midnight saying, "Don, what happened?" And I told her, and she was shocked, and she said, "Take as long as you want." And they gave me 2 weeks, and I thought that was just fantastic. But we had the funeral. Like I said, the church where I was at was fine, and they were very supportive. But it seemed like after the funeral, everybody went back to their own normal lives, and I felt like I was on an island all by myself. And so I started to look for resources, to go to see if there was some place where I could go to get help, a counselor, a group. And I remember going to a couple of groups. One of them was Compassionate Friends. But that didn't seem to be quite right for me because I was looking more for a Christian-oriented group that could help me get through this. And that's when I remember we were out driving one time and we had visited the church where Virgil attended, First Colony Church of Christ. And we had visited there one time. And I remember just going over there to see if there was anything else that they had, if they had any type of special program that could help. Well, it just so happened at that time, Virgil was starting Grief Share. And I don't know if you've heard of Grief Share, but it is a Christian-oriented 7-week program that helps you deal with loss. And so I remember telling my church, because it met at 7 o'clock on Sunday evenings. And at that time you had morning and evening services. And I remember telling my church, you won't see me for the next 7 weeks because I'm going to be over here at Grief Share. And the people that I met at Grief Share, that was 2003. I'm still friends with all of them to this day. It was a great experience from the standpoint of they taught us to deal with the grief and to express it and to talk to people about it and to verbalize it. That isn't how I was brought up. I was brought up, you suck it up and you don't cry, and then you just be a man and everything will be okay. Well, I rapidly found out after Elton died, that was just not the way life really is. So after that 7 weeks, I learned some things about myself and I learned some things about just life in general. First of all, the first thing I learned is that you don't get over something like this. You don't get over it, you learn how to live with it. As Virgil said earlier, life is different. For me, life was totally different. And so my thought was, okay, now that life is different, now that Elton's gone, what is my mission? What am I supposed to do? What does God want me to do? The first thing was for me and my family is make sure that we preserve the memory of Elton. And we have done that over the years. And I have to say this, this is Monday. On Wednesday, 2 days from now, would have been Elton's 45th birthday. Mm. So I'm going to be posting something on Facebook about that. But first of all, it was preserving his memory. The second one is, what can I do? And this is just my nature. What can I do to help other people that are in my situation? And at that time, I was teaching a Bible class. And it was about a year or so after I took Virgil's class that I actually presented a 2-week class to the class I was teaching at the church on grief, on recovery, on the cycle of grief, things like that. And it was an eye-opening experience for a lot of people. But I just think that that's the way that God wanted me to go. I still missed Elton, still cried from time to time, still do. But the thing is, I believe along with living with this and learning the new way, that the new normal, whatever that is, I also believe that there's no such thing as closure. I mean, what's gonna close this? He'll still be gone. So I learned some things about myself and some things that I needed to be doing because the alternative was just falling apart and just losing it. And that was really not an option for me at all. Let's go forward a little bit. I did get married again. And then in 2009, at the age of 52, my wife and I adopted a 2-year-old, Trinity. And it was great. It was just really, really great. Unfortunately, though, the marriage only lasted after that until about 2012, when my wife filed for divorce, and it just totally caught me and my whole family off guard. And that was a very, very difficult time. And the reason why it was a difficult time is because we made a promise to Trinity, and that was we would stay together as a couple until she was raised. And we broke our promise. And I remember saying that for a couple of years, we broke our promise to her. So here I am, age 52. I've been through the single parent thing once. Here I am going through it again. But God has been there with me. I've had a lot of resources, a lot of people that have been supporting me. And it has just really been, I've always said Trinity probably has added a few years to my life because I love kids. I think my greatest responsibility in life is being a dad and being a grandfather. So Trinity now, she'll turn 14 this year. It's amazing. Uh, so life had sort of returned to some type of a normalcy. We were in a routine. Things seemed to be going well. I have both my daughters, Mindy and Christy. And then something happened again that changed my life. And I'm still in the middle of this right now. This happened on August 25th last year. I was, in fact, on a Zoom meeting, and I got a call from my daughter, Mindy, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Christy's been shot." And I literally almost fell out of my chair. And so I said, "Where's she at?" She's at Memorial Hermann Hospital. I drove to the hospital, and I remember just audibly in the car saying, "God, don't let me lose another child. Don't let me lose another child." When I got to the hospital, my daughter was there, her husband, and some other folks. And long story short, she had been murdered by her ex-boyfriend when she was actually taking their child for a visitation. This has been totally different from the first time because that was a car accident and there was closure in a way that, you had the accident and then he was buried and then we could recover. This has no such, let's just say it is continuing, because along with dealing with a trial that's going to come up in September, we're also dealing with child custody issues because the courts saw it fit to give my 7-year-old grandson, Mason, her child to the killer's mother. And needless to say, the justice system doesn't hold high esteem in my eyes right now. But with all this going on, again, I asked 20 years ago, what does God want me to do? Well, when we were gathered at the hospital, when the doctor said that she was brain dead, we had one of the counselors, actually one of the counselors came in and said, do you want to donate Christy's organs? And we knew that's what Christy wanted to do. And so we did. And as it turned out, she ended up saving 6 lives. And one of the people that she saved is somebody who sings with me on the praise team at church. We had the option of choosing some people who could receive the organs, and this one person actually got Christy's left kidney. And 2 weeks ago, we met face to face for the first time after he had recovered. So for me, loss is devastating, but my job is to keep the memory of my kids alive, but it's also, what does God want me to do? I can't wallow in grief, even though I still have very, very tough days, especially since this is so fresh. But I feel God has given us purpose, and I feel that this is real life. And like I said, we can either fall apart, or we can say, what can I do to preserve their memory or to help others? And the other thing I have to say also, being a part of First Colony, I've got a wonderful support network. I literally 4 or 5 times a week, someone either texts me, calls me, or shoots me an email just to ask me how I'm doing. So that's my story for right now. Sorry, I ran a little bit over. You know me, Virgil. I had a stopwatch on me. But that's my story for right now. We're still going through it right now, but we're a strong family, but we're only strong because God gives us the strength to make it through something like this.
Well, I was aware you were going over, and the others as well. And you know what? It's okay. It would have been inappropriate to stop because the stories are so powerful and meaningful. All 3 of you. I'm so grateful to you. Judy, I can't get the dancing or the ballet elephant out of my head now. That's terrific. I mean, what an image. What an image. And all that you went through with Charles during that time, and then certainly with the multiple myeloma. And you described it so well. It's even the calmest of people get worn down by that. So, Jose, so poignant to deal with not only the mental illness, whatever it is, whatever the cause was. I know you got more than one diagnosis, but then to have some of the shame put on top of it, and the religious part. Wow, that just hurts. It just hurts to hear that. And I really liked at the end where you differentiate between despair and desperation. And it's okay to be desperate because that's now and here, and what that's today is how I heard you say it. Despair means it'll never get better, and indeed it may not. Where I get snagged is in that very place when I start jumping ahead and say, oh my gosh, this is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And it very well may. We can't deny that, but we can't live that way all the time. We have now. What can we do now? So I appreciate you bringing that out from your experience. And Don, you have found ways to find purpose in all of this, and yet been very real about the pain, the loss. You have claimed the grief and owned it, and you still do. You still do. And I think that's where, at least in my opinion, some of the American culture gets this idea of closure. Well, aren't you over it yet? Shouldn't you be moving forward? Those kind of statements that, boy, they sure sound good, but they usually come from people who haven't been through anything. You know, I often hear at trials, like so the trial that will probably happen in your case, the reporter will often say, well, at least the family will get some closure now. It will change for the family, but they will not get closure on a brutal shooting. You just don't. So there's just so much to gain from each of you. This is the reason I wanted to hear these stories, because you're teaching us. I would ask, just kind of as a wrap up, all of you have probably learned, I know you've learned ways to cope and deal. What have you found to be least helpful to you, either from advice or what you just practiced yourself? And maybe what's been most helpful? Just very quickly, give me something that keeps you going or kept you grounded when you didn't want to go on. Judy?
Well, I found some books that were life-saving for me, and I'm a book person. I had dear friends that stayed with me. Stayed on the journey with me past, a year or so. They were still having me for coffee, and for every week we would get together, kind of that. So that was very helpful. And a number of people were that way, but I found a book that was written by a pastor here in Abilene. His name was Peter James Flaming, Jim Flaming. He was a Baptist pastor, a wonderful man. The city loved him. And he had studied his seminary study. He emphasized chaplaincy and grief work. And then he had been a pastor for so many years. And then he lost his beloved 33-year-old son to leukemia. So when I saw his book, a friend gave me it's just a little paperback. It's called Healing the Heartbreak of Grief. And it absolutely went through exactly what I needed. It talked about the huge heartbreak of grief. And then at each of chapter, he would put, today I can remember, and today I can do this for tribute, like light a candle or so. Anyway, but I could only get through the first few chapters for about 2 years, because at the end it was moving on, and I was not going to read the end of that because I wasn't ready. So I'm still, but just having somebody that I respected, and it's like you were saying, Don, it was like, of course you've got this heartbreak, of course. And then I learned that phrase about the wisdom of grief. It changes everything about a person. You either learn a lot about yourself and about life and how to go on, or you don't. And that was helpful to me.
Good. You were asked the title of the book and you said it, Healing the Heartbreak of Grief.
Right. And the other one was The Year of Magical Thinking.
Okay.
And
Good.
another one was a Jewish book that I pulled out about the Shiva and all that. I read that. That is so helpful. They did this thing about making, they have a 30-day mourning period, and I used it step by step. It was very helpful.
Was it?
What has been helpful to me, as you know, as an educator, we're always looking at different books about different perspectives and, you know, books that we use for students as they process the grief with patience. But actually what has been helpful to me personally is, again, to find, besides the professional counselors, to find people and friends that are not directly impacted by my crisis, but that they can allow me to be where I am and to not necessarily expect a good behavior from me during this crisis, or to say, well, I'm an ordained minister, by the way. I'm an ordained minister, so as an ordained minister, I should think or feel or be this way. I don't find that helpful. I find helpful when people allow me to be where I am, with my questions and with my struggles and with whatever tensions that I have between what Carrie Dorrance called the embedded versus the deliberative theology. And just to be where I am now, not to always try to find, okay, so what is going to be the new normal, or what do you hope like future is, and that the hope is in the future. And I it's not that I want to move away. I don't know what the future is. When I saw the first picture that you show in this presentation, I mean, it looks nice straight, but it's very hard to see the end. And so I don't, it's almost like I quit already trying to go and see the end. It's helpful to find people that are with me where I am. It's not helpful when, again, they're trying to fix, or they're trying to get me to think about hopeful stuff and future stuff and things that could be different for future. And that is not helpful. I want to be in the present, and I want people to be with me where I am.
As a human being, not as a minister, right?
Yes.
Very good. Don?
For me, I think the thing that's been most helpful, and I have to go back when I was young, is the way I was brought up in terms of my faith tradition. For me, yes, I go to church. You do churchy things on Sunday. But as I always tell my classes, 99% of your worship is outside of the walls of the church. And for me, my faith comes like breathing. It is just natural as I live, how I treat people. And what I also tell my classes is, we spend years and years in church, but what happens when things fall apart? What happens when life does not go as you anticipated it would go? What happens when the rubber meets the road? And for me, like I said, I appreciate my faith tradition because I was brought up around people who didn't practice just a church faith. It's like everything, it was involved in everything that they did. And that's the way it is with me too, just simply because I always say, this is real life. And nobody guarantees me to have anything perfect. But I think that's where my faith steps in and just helps me determine what happens next. Now, as far as what is not helpful, I'll put it this way: what would be more helpful to me is, because I've lost 2 children, sometimes people are afraid to mention them around me. It's just the opposite. I would love for somebody to come up to me and say, tell me about your kids.
Yep.
I mean, they're not here, but I'm still a father and I still enjoy talking about them. So what would be helpful is if people would not be afraid that they're going to say something wrong, but say, tell me about Elton, tell me about Christy. And that would make me very happy.
I'll concur with that one. I was speaking with Jose's group this morning about grief and talking about Carol, and I said, I love it when somebody comes up and says, oh, I was thinking of Carol the other day, or tell me what she was like when, and let me get to tell those stories. It's amazing. Just hearing the name spoken out loud is very. There's one question that I saw about anger with God that we won't tackle the whole thing, but I do think it is important to acknowledge for many of us who have a faith life that anger with God, the wrestling with God over why this happened, and particularly the tragedy of it all, is part of it. It's part of it. I come at it from the book of Psalms, which is full of laments. It's full of people shaking their fist and saying, enough, enough, enough. Where are you? How long, oh Lord, how long? I find that many people, myself included, have not been given permission to do that in my faith group. And often if you talk about you're angry with God, sometimes people say, well, now you're not really angry with God. Well, yeah, I am. Don't tell me I'm not when I just told you I am, because that's a threatening statement to many people. But I do think it's part of life. We get angry with each other in human relationships and we stay together. My anger with God does not mean I don't have faith. It just means I don't feel that presence right now in a way that I need it. So there's your real quick answer to that one. And I'll let Cyrus handle that one because he's the expert on everything. So I'm going to go back to the screen sharing for just a second to close with some very quick things. Let's see, screen share. Go. All right. This is just some quick ideas to maybe jot how we find resilience, and you've heard each of our people talk about it. First of all, we've got to acknowledge this is loss, this is grief, this is tragic, and there's nothing less than those kind of words that acknowledge it. I find that you can refresh yourself, at least for short periods of time, with meditation, certainly with music, with prayer, and with reading. And when you're in the crisis of grief or transition or whatever the crisis is, all of those things don't come naturally. You almost have to force yourself to do those, but they really do make some difference. I have to change the scenery when I'm overwhelmed. I have to go outside and sit in nature or go for a walk. And I'm convinced it does reboot us inside a little bit and reminds us that the world is still going on beyond our tragedy. Exactly what Jose just said. Find a trusted confidant, one who genuinely listens, who's not going to try to talk you out of who you are, but just will be with you. Those are treasured friends when you find them. This one's hard for me. Lower my sense of independence and ask for needed help. Many of us, pride gets in the way. And when I'm not functioning well because of crisis and I need help, I have learned to ask for that help. And that's been a growth pattern for me. And then finally, remember you are created with more inner strength than you realize. This actually follows what Judy had said earlier. We have more than we sometimes realize within us. I'm going to close with a song. This is kind of a meditative song for us. And then when it is over, I will turn it back to Cyrus to wrap up. The words are there and you can follow along with it.
When troubles come and my heart burdens me, when I am still and wait in silence, until you come and sit a while with me. There is no life without its hunger. Each restless heart beats so imperfectly. But when you come and I wonder, sometimes I think I glimpse eternity. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up to more than
My heartfelt gratitude to all of you. Thank you so much, Cyrus, for helping set it up and panel. You're a treasure to me. Thank you so much. Cyrus, if you'll put your email on there and whatever words of wisdom you'd like to share with us.
Well, I don't have any words of wisdom to add. Just gratitude for all four of you, your humanity, and your courage, especially, which was shared by more than a couple people in the chat. Let me just voice that. It's a brave thing. So appreciate you all for blessing us tonight. May God bless each and every one of you. And I hope we all convene in the same community next week. Hope to see you again then. So next week's on being a caregiver, which we've already heard some of tonight. So we'll hear more powerful stories, I trust, next week. Thank you very much, Virgil, for gathering such an incredible group of individuals and for sharing your own wisdom. So we appreciate you. And to all of you, be well. Have a good night.